Chapter 20. When we finished our work 3 hours later, I was thoroughly exhausted. After bidding me goodnight, he left to go get a new cabin. I changed and dropped into bed, falling asleep almost instantly. But it was not a restful sleep. My dreams were plagued with images of the doctor lurching around the bridge, holding his head with a look of intense pain on his face, and the captain yelling frantic orders at officers who ignored his words, while a smiling Commander Howitz held a giant blaster that pointed at everyone at once, and August cowered in a corner. Gilders was never anywhere to be seen. He was invisible. I bolted up when the commander's blaster was fired, adrenaline rushing through my body. In a shocked state, I sat there for several minutes, staring at the bland wall of my quarters. Then I let out a long breath. It had only been a dream. Letting myself go limp, I dropped back down again and looked at the equally bland ceiling. I listened to the faint humming of the life support systems, then rolled over on my side and shut my eyes. Finally, I sat up, throwing the blankets off and swinging my legs over the side of the bed, letting them hit the floor hard. It was no use. I couldn't sleep. Grabbing my wristcom, I checked the time. 3 o'clock. The day shift wouldn't begin for another 3 hours. I strapped the comm on and formed a decision. August had told me for the reversal of eradication to work, the victim had to be in the same room as the device. So even once we got the machine away from Commander Howitz's quarters, we would have to get the doctor as well. And right now, no one knew where he was. I didn't allow my mind to suggest the possibility that we might not be able to get to the machine. I dressed in the dark, feeling vaguely that the light would attract the attention of one of my adversaries, though the sensible part of me knew that was impossible. Then I unlocked my door and slipped out into the dim halls. Although I knew it was futile, I tried his room first. It wasn't locked, and I peered inside, my eyes still adjusted to the darkness. Nothing. He wasn't there. Fighting the urge to cry just at the sight of his empty room, I kept on down the hall resolutely. Someone, somewhere, had to know where he was. For a moment, I contemplated asking Commander Howitz to allow me to go see him. I quickly discarded the idea, however, when I remembered that he'd likely used the machine in the first place to keep me from consulting the doctor. He would probably fear that if I saw him again now, I would be more unwilling than ever to come with him. That was impossible, since I was already as unwilling as I could be. Shaking away these thoughts, I tried to reason logically. Who might know where the doctor was being held? Well, what was keeping him from simply walking out of whatever room he was in? He must be guarded. At least, it was highly likely. As far as I knew, the majority of the mutineers, if not all of them, were from engineering. And all but the first engineer's quarters were on D-deck. Deciding it was as good a theory as any, I slipped to the elevator and wrote it down. When the elevator doors opened again, the long row of cabin doors made my spirit sink. I couldn't knock on every one of them. That would be absurd, and besides, someone was sure to realize what I was doing long before I was done. Kerwin, the young man I'd treated the day of the mutiny. He was an engineering mate. Surely he'd know something. Merritt was his last name. I began walking down the hall, eyeing every nameplate carefully. I tried to keep my boots from ticking on the hard floor as I stepped along, reading each name. No, not that one. That wasn't it. There it was. Ensign Kerwin Merritt. I raised my finger to press his door chime, then hesitated for an instant. It was so early. Was it right to wake him? This wasn't some ordinary situation. This was about life and death. He could get his sleep later. Resolutely, I pressed the chime and waited. Silence for a moment in which he would have had plenty of time to get up and cross the room. I rang again. This time it was only a few seconds before the door slid open and his youthful face appeared before me, blinking sleepily in the dim light. He looked so much younger when he was sleepy, I felt like I'd awakened a little boy. A twinge of guilt pecked me, but I shook it off. This was no time for etiquette. "Kerwin, it's me, Andi Lloyd," I said quietly. Yes, he muttered, trying to open his eyes wider. I'm sorry to wake you, but it's important. Do you have any idea where they're keeping Dr. Lloyd? I need to find him so I can help him. He stared at me groggily, clearly trying to think. I fought back the urge to reach out, grab his shoulders, and shake him. No matter that he was 3 inches taller than me, he still looked like a sleepy little boy. Dr. Lloyd, he muttered. Dr. Lloyd. I think I heard something. Just a minute. I bit my lip to keep myself from bursting with impatience. I didn't have extra minutes. We only had until noon to save the doctor. He opened his eyes a bit wider, and the tiniest spark of realization appeared in them. Dr. Lloyd, yes. I don't know the cabin number, but I know Ensign Shellhammer is guarding him. In his own room, I think. There are 2 guards. Shellhammer. I nodded as I impressed the name on my memory. Thank you, Kerwin. I'm sorry I woke you. Any time, he murmured, retreating into the room and letting the door close again. I crept down the hall, scanning the nameplates for a Shellhammer. It was at the far end of the hall, Ensign Darren Shellhammer. I didn't know him. He was probably a part of the night crew. Suppressing the naughty feeling in the pit of my stomach, I pressed the door chime and waited. This time I didn't have to push it twice. Before I expected it, the door shot open and a stern, stalwart, broad-shouldered man appeared before me, blaster in hand. Recovering from the silence the shock had forced on me, I spoke falteringly. I'm Andi Lloyd. I just... Is the doctor awake? He furrowed his brows. Why? I just want to see him. I looked pleadingly into the man's eyes. Surely he would see how desperate I was. I just want to see how he's doing, only for a moment. He looked doubtfully at me, the inflexibility of his expression not abating. We stood like this for a moment. Then I heard another voice. What is it, Darren? Another crewman, shorter and slighter, pushed past the first one. He saw me and then looked sorry. Miss Lloyd? I nodded. I recognized him, though I didn't know his name. He'd been in sickbay the week before, and I'd helped the doctor set his broken finger. You just wanted to visit your father? I wanted to see the doctor, yes. He looked up at the taller guard. She can come in for a moment. This was said in a quiet but authoritative tone. Darren looked unsure about this. But the commander said... Without acknowledging that his partner had spoken, the shorter guard nodded at me. Only a moment. Looking my thanks, I moved past the men into the room, trying not to tremble with fear of what I might find there. Even after the dim corridors, the room was dark. I could just barely make out a thin form seated in a low chair in one corner. The doctor. His head was bowed stiffly over his hands, which were laying listlessly across his bony knees. As my eyes became more accustomed to the gloom, I saw that his face was dazed and moist, and water covered the front of his half-opened shirt and had dripped down onto his pant legs. He stared at his hands and didn't look up as I approached. Tears ran down my cheeks unchecked as I noted the gauntness of his cheekbones and the increased lines on his forehead. I hardly recognized him. Kneeling in front of him, I took his damp hands in mine. His fingers were wrinkled from excessive immersion in water, and his skin was cold and clammy. Looking up into his eyes, I pleaded, "Doctor, do you know me?" There was a moment of silence, then he looked into my face. "Remind me again of your name?" "Andi. It's me, Andi." There was a momentary pause, then he spoke slowly, his voice quiet and tense. "I knew someone by that name. She was my daughter." "That's me. I am your daughter, Doctor." He looked me in the eyes, and hazy surprise registered. "Lavinia? What are you doing here? Where is Sarah?" I squeezed his hands gently. "Sarah's gone. It's me, Andi." He looked down at my hands, and his trembled. Then he looked closely at me again. There was a moment of gripping silence as he studied my face, and then a flash of recognition lit up his eyes. He grasped my hands tighter. "Andi!" I smiled through my tears. "Doctor, we know what's wrong with you." "What's wrong with me?" "Yes, we're going to help you. We're going to help you remember everything again." He sighed. "I don't understand what you're saying." "You don't have to. Don't worry. Just try to hang on until I come back. Try to remember." "Remember what?" I leaned close to him. "Do you remember the time Crash took us out for our first space flight? You got sick." He looked confused again. "Crash?" "Eagle Crash, your nephew. Do you remember him? Do you remember when your parents died and you had to raise Sarah by yourself? Do you remember when she married Miles Crash and left you alone? Do you remember when she died and Crash came to live with us? Don't you remember, Doctor?" His fingers gripped tighter and his face twisted as he tried desperately to recall the things I said. "Crash, Sarah was my sister. You were her best friend. She had blonde hair and blue eyes." I had never met the beautiful Sarah Crash, but I had seen pictures of her. I nodded. "She left me alone. My parents left me. Journey left me." My tears started up again. He'd rarely talked to me about his parents, and I didn't know who Journey was, but it was clear that he was remembering. "Then I found the child. She needed me. I took her because I had to, but I kept her because I loved her. She did not leave me." My heart threatened to break. "Doctor," my trembling voice began, but a hand was laid firmly on my shoulder, and the guard named Darren spoke. "You should go now." Before standing, I gave his hands one last squeeze and whispered, "I trust you, Doctor. I'll be back. We'll save you. Wait for me. Keep remembering." The lost look had come back to his face, but he nodded before looking back down at his wet hands. "I must wash my hands," he said softly. "I must wash them." Guided through the dark by the tall lieutenant, I stumbled out of the room and just barely took the time to grasp the other guard's hand warmly for a moment before stepping out into the comparative brightness of the corridor. The door slid shut behind me. It took me several moments to recover sufficiently to even walk down the hall. I rubbed the rough sleeve of my uniform across my eyes, trying to wipe away the tears. Now I knew where he was. I had to think. We still had to get to the machine and then get him out. Then we had to work the machine, but we also had to get help. We couldn't get the ship back on our own. The commander and the two scientists were too smart for that. Glancing at my wristcom, I saw that it was already past 4. Could it really have been over an hour since I woke up? I couldn't wait any longer to contact Crash. If I did, he wouldn't be able to make it in time to help us.